and good day to everyone. Thanks for joining us in this special presentation of Counseling and Culture. In this presentation, we are going to look at a Western theory of grief and evaluate its transferability to the Japanese culture. Grief and bereavement is such an important topic today, with the COVID-19 pandemic causing death worldwide around 6 million and counting. So today we have four special speakers to evaluate the four tasks of grief developed by William Worden, specifically focusing on the second task of grief. It is important to note at this stage, Worden theorized that each of these tasks can be viewed as independent standalone tasks, as opposed to progressive stages in which theories such as the loss theory is often viewed. Warden's view on the second task of grief is that pain needs to be experienced, processed, and expressed. So over the next 20 minutes, we'll go through the definition of grief and bereavement by me, Nur Huda. And we have our expert speaker, Xuan, who will give an overview on the four tasks of grief. Then moving on to focus on the second task of grief and the cultural context within which it was developed by our expert Joe. Then we have a special guest from Japan, Shuyi, who will share the Japanese cultural view on death, grief, and bereavement. Following this, we will appraise the transferability of the theory to the Japanese cultural context, and our last expert, Freya, will discuss cultural appropriate adaptations for the theory for the Japanese culture. Okay, what is grief? Is it mere sadness following death? We will all face it if we are fortunate enough. Does that mean all of us will experience grief? Although multiple studies have been conducted, there has been never an agreed consensus, even among authors from the same discipline, on a theoretical or empirical definition of grief. Both view grief as an adaptational response, while some other authors have debated whether grief can be considered as an illness. Lindman contended that normal grief is an intense crisis and therefore usually can be resolved in 6 to 8 weeks. At the same time, he said maybe it is a syndrome, which was also agreed by Parkes in 1972. The definition of grief, lastly, as suggested by Worden, is that grief is a person's reaction to bereavement, comprised of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors experienced after the loss that change over time. What about bereavement? According to Volkart and Michael, it is the emotional state, behavior, and conduct of the survivors immediately following the experience of separation by death from a person who fulfills dependency needs, especially related to emotional interaction. Therefore, we can say that grief is actually the feeling of loss, and bereavement is focusing on the absence of being, while mourning is remembering with care and sorrow, and this can be done collectively together with other people. Next, we have our expert, Xuan. Xuan, can you give us a quick overview on the William Worden's four tasks of grief?
Okay, I'll introduce my part, the four tasks of grief. First one is accept the loss. It means increase the reality of the loss. Some denial is purposeful, as it allows you to slowly digest the full extent of the loss. However, staying in denial or doing nothing is an act of acceptance. You must face your denial and accept that the loss has occurred. Acceptance is surrender to reality. You must therefore acknowledge the loss rather than pretend that. The second task is experience the pain of grief. It means assist the person to deal with expressed or underlying emotions. For whatever reason, we are afraid of having painful feelings in our culture. We take medication and distract ourselves with entertainment to avoid the discomfort. But this doesn't help us. Avoidance only adds to our pain. And the third task is readjust to a new environment where the decrease didn't exist. It means that assist the person to overcome obstacles to the readjustment process. This kind of reasoning can get you into trouble. You must adjust and adapt to the new normal, which means reorienting and reorganizing your life. And the last task is rebating emotional energy on other relationships. It means that encourage the person to say goodbye to their deceased in a healthy way and be open to rebating feelings on the new relationship, even if the decrease is gone and the regrets left behind are irreparable. It is important to start a new life with precious memories and at the same time be stronger for having no a loved one. That's all. Thanks for listening my part.
Yeah, thank you so much, Xuan, for the very good overview on the four tasks of grief. Next, we have Joe, our expert. Joe, can you explain the cultural context within which the second task of grief was developed?
Yes, of course, I'd be delighted to do that. Worden states that for task 2, pain needs to be experienced, processed, and expressed. His view is that the survivor needs to analyse the pain of loss to fulfil the grief process, and also that it's very important to avoid suppressing or ignoring the pain of grief. When we translate this into the counselling relationship from a Western perspective, it means that we actively encourage a client's expression and processing of emotion within therapy. I'll give you some background information on William Worden, which will help to explain the context within which this theory was formed. Worden was raised and educated in the USA, and his primary therapy is Gestalt therapy. He was also significantly influenced by Bowlby's attachment theory when he developed the 4 tasks of grief. So let's look at John Bowlby's attachment theory first. This theory provides a way for us to conceptualise the tendency of human beings to create strong affectional bonds with others. Consequently, it also gives us a way to understand the strong emotional reaction when these bonds are broken, such as in bereavement. Bowlby states that these broken bonds will often manifest as sadness, anger, anxiety, guilt, depression, or loneliness. It's also interesting to note that Bowlby states that sooner or later those who avoid conscious grieving will break down, usually with depression. This ties in with Worden's view on this second task, namely that it's vital to confront and process the emotions that manifest during grief. Both Worden and Bowlby also share the view that if grief is not expressed at the time it is experienced, it can turn into prolonged or complicated grief. Let's move on now to consider the influence of Gestalt theory on the formation of Worden's second task. Gestalt theory was developed in Germany in the 1940s by Fritz Perls and Laura Perls, who were psychoanalysts in Frankfurt and Berlin. It's a humanistic therapy, and so it focuses on the person and the uniqueness of their experience. It emphasises free will, human potential, and self-discovery, with an aim to help an individual develop a strong sense of self. Focus on the present is key, and the counsellor will bring the client back to the present if they are spending too much time in the past, or if anxiety is speeding them into the future. Gestalt theory also recognises the need to work through pain. Where individuals have shut down emotional hurt or painful memories, the therapist understands that things will come to the client's awareness when the client is ready for healing in that area. Therapeutic rapport is key in building trust and safety for this to happen. Worden's theory shares the Gestalt perspective that the therapist is not the expert. He recognises that the client requires and should be encouraged to have space to explore their feelings without judgment. The goal is for the client to accept personal responsibility for the ownership and acceptance of their feelings. So, to give an overview of the cultural context within which Worden's second task was built, there are a few points to mention. Worden, Bowlby and Gestalt theories all originate from a Western perspective. They were developed within individualistic societies, and there's a view that the client and counsellor is seen as equals on a journey together rather than in a teacher-learner relationship. There's also an expectation that clients will be able to freely express and process strong emotions such as guilt, anger, loneliness, and sadness within the counselling room. And finally, there is an expectation that a non-judgmental therapeutic relationship can be formed with a counsellor that will enable these emotions to be expressed, explored, and fully processed. The consequence of this would therefore lead to movement through the grief process. I'll conclude by referring to this quote by Worden, which gives recognition to the influence of society on his theory. He says, "There may be a subtle interplay between society and the mourner that make task 2 more difficult. Society may be uncomfortable with the mourner's feelings, and this can lead to the mourners feeling their grief as stigmatised, unhealthy, or demoralising." Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe, for the excellent description on task 2. Now, let's take some time to explore the concept and look at how this theory may transfer to a Japanese culture. We're delighted to have Shuyi, who from Japan, with us today. Konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa.
Shuyi, can you tell us a bit about death, grief, and bereavement based on the Japanese cultural perspective?
Yes, sure. So before going to grief, we need to understand Japanese view on death. There are differing views on death and depending on religion, which are either Shintoism, Buddhism. Those who identify as Shinto may view dying and death as an impure process. Buddhism's interpretation of death is that the dying process is perfectly normal and to be expected. Shinto beliefs about death and the afterlife are often considered dark and negative. All traditions describe death as a dark underground realm with a river separating the living from the dead. The images are very similar to Greek mythology and the concept of hate. Mourning is seen as a natural reaction to days the family experience together. Most of the time, grief should be shown in a controlled, almost stoic way, where we can see that they hold the deceased in highest honor and respect. Mature ritual is a solemn occasion more to show solidarity or support for the survivors, less on individual grief or collective sorrows. It's unlike the other East Asian wailing rituals. Wailing or loud sobbing frowned upon as it reminds guests the presence of death or pollution. And intensity of grief is actually being mitigated by the series of rituals to purify and placate departed spirits. The Japanese bereavement is a slow process. We believe that the journey to the afterlife called Juin takes 49 days, where the family of the deceased will be in a period of mourning after the funeral. Once a week, they will visit the grave to place fresh flowers and to burn incense. During these 49 days, the family cannot participate in any form of celebration or entertainment. The rituals help the crossing another world, which is to cross the river of the dead to where the spirits reside. The spirits can then connect and visit the present world when people correctly perform rituals and festivals. These are the rituals done at a typical Japanese funerals. On the left, we can see that the rituals done by attendees during the week, and on the right shows the body being cremated. The family then places the remains in an urn. Ashes may be spread or urns may be buried within the family headstone. Small gifts are placed on the grave by family members and friends of the deceased individual. Once a year, the headstone is cleaned and new gifts are left for the deceased loved ones. Shinto believes that the ancestral spirits will protect their descendants. The prayers and rituals performed by living honor the dead and memorize them. In return, the spirits of the dead offer protection and encouragement for the living. To summarize, in Japanese culture, expression of grief is held proudly within the household and not in public. There is a recognition of continuity between life and death. A spirit belongs to the same family and the same local community before and after the death. Families gather for Oban, a traditional festival for ancestor worship in August, believe that spirits of their ancestors come home, reuniting with their family during Oban. The dead continue as a family member beyond the limit of physical existence. This may augment the feeling of attachment between the bereaved and the dead, helping people forward their grieving process in a more peaceful way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Arigatou gozaimasu.
どういたしまして。
Yeah, okay. Next, we have to recap from what we've learned so far. So to compare, we have the gel start theory, which focuses on the present. In the normal counseling, it will make us encourage the client to move on without the disease and develop a strong sense of self and free will. However, in Japanese culture, this may have to be adapted in view of the belief that the ancestors are still present and guardian to the survivors and the family actually mourn together. According to Bowlby's attachment theory, the attachment to the deceased is highlighted to be broken, whereas there is strong attachment in the Japanese culture due to the belief of continuity between life and death. Lastly, according to Warden and Bowlby, is encouraged to express the loss in individual counseling, while in Japanese culture, they do not confront or express the emotions with others due to the expression being held in private. So it may be inappropriate to express strong feelings to someone outside the family. So based on this information, we go on to the next expert, Freya. So how we might use these some culturally appropriate alternatives or adaptations. So Freya, can you explain to us or give some suggestion on how we are going to adapt according to this theory to the understanding of Japanese culture?
Yeah, of course. So based on this information, what I will do is just explore a little bit how we can adapt Warden's second task for our Japanese clients, whilst hopefully still paying respect to their culture. I think an important thing to mention is research that suggests that there are three main contributing factors that might provide inaccessibility of cross-cultural counselling. And these are thought to be language barriers, class differences, in which the therapist is often seen to be coming from a more middle-class privileged perspective, and culture-bound values that are used to judge normality and abnormality in our clients. Obviously, these contributing factors are really important to consider when we apply Warden's task to Japanese clients, just because we need to consider that as Western counsellors, we may be providing some of these barriers, and hopefully through time we will be able to knock these down and develop more adaptations and theories that will mean that there are less barriers to access in this type of counselling. What I will do now is discuss some of the adaptations that we as counsellors can make in order to hopefully accommodate our clients' culture during our sessions. So whilst Warden's task does state that there is a need for experiencing the pain and emotion of grief, there are cultural differences between Western counsellors and Japanese clients, which means there is a difference in understanding the importance of this. For example, Japanese people, as she mentioned, mourning and the expression of emotion through things like wailing and sobbing is often seen as negative. It can remind people of the loss that they are facing. So research by Anthony Marcella has suggested that in order to avoid embarrassing our Japanese clients through this, we can acknowledge their emotional response, but it is really important that we should remain minimal and non-prying in this. And further to this, he also says that it is really important that as counsellors we do remain curious. That is so that we don't jump to conclusions about the emotions that our clients are displaying. For example, something that we might perceive as anger might actually be frustration, and misunderstanding that emotion could lead to embarrassment for the client if it isn't what they intended to express. Interestingly, though, there is research done by a group of guys called Oshini, Hufumi and Farah, and they suggest that another way to avoid embarrassing our clients is actually to allow silence within the therapy room and to sit and remain with that silence. It's often commonplace in Japanese culture to silently ponder on your thoughts and to think about them in a very calm and relaxed way, and letting your client do this and allowing them to communicate with you non-verbally is really important. It brings in those Japanese nuances and allows that to almost for them to direct the session rather than the counsellor directing it. Also, Marcella has suggested that something that could help with sessions with Japanese clients is actually to educate them on typical therapeutic practice in Western cultures. The fact that it is person-centered, the fact that it's non-directive, quite empathic, the fact that the client is supposed to lead the session rather than the therapist acting in more of a directive manner. And explaining this sort of behaviour could hopefully help to alleviate any misunderstanding, and it could explain any unexpected behaviour. But most importantly, what it provides is an opportunity for the client to acknowledge areas of practice that they are not comfortable with and that they think steps over their culture and would be inappropriate in the therapist-client relationship. So moving on, as Bulby and Warden have suggested, delaying the acknowledgement of loss can often lead to complicated grief. However, it is really important to consider what she had mentioned about the 49 days that Japanese people take to complete mortuary rituals. We need to consider as counsellors whether when the client comes to seek our help, whether this is something that needs to be taken into account with the contract that we form, whether they will need to be taking 49 days away from counselling to complete these rituals, or whether counselling is something that can happen during this time. It is also really important to think about whether emotional exploration would be considered any form of celebration around death, and if so, then it would be important to focus our sessions with the client on something maybe a little bit different to do with the rituals or something like that. And then once that has been established, I think it's really important to remain open and congruent and to address any cultural differences that there might be between counsellor and client. For example, how they could affect the relationship. I know that in a lot of Japanese culture, people will worship the Buddha or they will hold belief in a kami. And whilst I might not share that same belief, or a Western counsellor might not share that same belief, I think it's really important to acknowledge and to bring it into sessions if this is something that is important to our client. As well, Oshini and Hifumi have suggested that understanding and engaging with the belief that there are ancestors in Japanese culture and bringing them to be present within the counselling session, it can actually help to form a stronger bond between counsellor and client. So that is definitely something to consider and to bring into sessions, hopefully. And further to this, it's really important, I think, to remain open and curious about the idea of the collectivist nature of Japanese societies and social connections. Within these communities, there is typically a lineal hierarchy, and often doing things like disobeying your elders is seen to be really shameful. And Oshini would suggest that keeping all of these Japanese traditions and the collectivist nature of Japanese societies within the sessions will hopefully help to pave a less shameful counselling session for the client, and also hopefully will help them form a stronger bond. And I think just quickly, it's really important to mention that whilst family is extremely important within Japanese societies, there isn't much research surrounding whether family counselling of bereavement would be helpful. I think that it's definitely something to consider and something to look into. And last, but certainly not least, I thought that it would be good to mention briefly what we as counsellors can do outside of the therapy room in order to make sure that our sessions with our client are fruitful. And a couple of things that I thought of would be to work on our own biases, bring these up in supervision sessions and work on them and address how we can work through them. To remain congruent within sessions and within supervision, that's just to allow an open mind and to allow yourself to be further educated by your client. We could do research, we could delve into their religion, hopefully gain a deeper understanding to help build that connection. And then, as always, just to be open to criticism. And if there is something that you've done that your client doesn't enjoy, to work on that and hopefully make sure it doesn't happen again. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. I think those are brilliant ideas. Okay, so there you go, the evaluation of William Morgan's second task of grief, suitability and adaptation to the Japanese culture. Thank you very much to all our expert contributors and our guests from Japan today. And thank you all for listening.